Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to go over a portion of David Allen's new book, To the Jew First. But first, I want to go over a bit of background information. In 2013, a pastor named Brent Lay discovered that Romans is written in two parts. The first 8 chapters exclusively to Jewish Christians, and the second 8 chapters exclusively to Gentile Christians. He says this: "When I came upon this personal discovery, I spent several months searching for historical evidence of others who took this position. I say discovery because I first realized this revelation on Thursday, June 6, 2013, about 10:15 in the morning, while on vacation in Florida." And that is Roman numeral page 10 in his 2017 book. His first book came out in 2015, and he updated it in 2017. The updated version hinges on a misreading of Romans 1:13 and asserts that Paul is not addressing a church comprised largely of Gentiles in the first half of the letter, though the verse is clear on its face. "I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles." Lay claims that he discovered that the you does not clearly modify an identifiable noun, calling this missing noun an ambiguous antecedent. Lay further asserts that the phrase "as well as among" means that you is not part of the rest of the Gentiles. He's got it exactly wrong. "As well as among the rest of" connects you to Gentiles, meaning that both groups share a commonality. They are both Gentiles. Lay's idea is so novel, virtually no one had ever heard of it before. Enter Jason Breda. A YouTuber named Jason Breda, calling his channel Good Berean, formerly Living Christian, read Lay's book and introduced it as a portion of his argument in a debate with James White in early 2024. White expressed his understandable surprise. Not to be deterred, Breda developed a series of videos he calls Two-Part Romans, which has 10 sessions to date. Then followed David L. Allen, a college professor, dean, coach of preachers, and writer. He had never heard of the idea either. Believing it worth discussing, he wrote a book called To the Jew First, releasing the print version on October 31st, 2024, mere days before the release of Breda's 10th video in his series. The goal of this video, and any other videos that may follow, is to provide a response to Allen's book, and will touch on various points made by Lay and Breda. First, I want to give you a summarized review, giving you my opinion. Then later I'll go through my ideas one at a time, Lord willing. This is a poorly argued position based on the same or similar misreading of Romans 1, 5, and 6, and 13, as shown by Brent Lay and Jason Breda. It takes possibilities of different meanings and suggests that absolutes could result. That's hinging on equivocation. This is an illogical process, for we do not conclude definitively from ideas that are uncertain. In so doing, Allen makes several mistakes, not the least of which include contradictions that undermine his own arguments. Contradictions exist in those portions of the book discussing the use of the phrase "the rest of" or "the other," the boldness of Paul's preaching, the meaning of third-person references, and the meaning of election. Let's go through these contradictions in some detail. The use of the phrase "the rest of" or "the other." Allen suggests that the phrase "the rest of the Gentiles" does not definitively mean that you in Romans 1:13 are Gentiles, and says Jews would be the possible antecedent here. Allen says this: "In our verse, that I may reap some harvest among you as well as the rest of the Gentiles." The question is, who are the you? It could be Gentiles or it could be Jews. Some translations, however, read "as well as the other Gentiles" at this point. It is important to remember, as Allen doesn't quote those translations here. Later, in examining Paul's other writings, Allen says this: In Ephesians 4:17, when Paul declares, "You henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk," he makes the distinction that suggests he is writing to Gentiles and not to Jewish believers. Thesis 92, page 142. This shows that Allen fully understands that the "you" is part of the group other Gentiles, the uniting characteristic being that both groups are Gentiles, connected by the word other, a very similar construction as seen in Romans 1:13. This contradicts his claim about the so-called ambiguous antecedent of Romans 1:13. There isn't one. Jason Breda did the same thing in his two-part Romans video session 1, the ambiguous antecedent. At timestamp 29:59, Breda says, "There's so much more for us to go into, and I'm so excited to get through the rest of these sessions." The phrase "the rest of these sessions" means that the current session in which Breda is speaking is part of a larger group that includes the rest of these sessions, namely his two-part Romans video series. He used this construction naturally as part of normal speech. He clearly recognizes that the natural reading of Romans 1:13, what it should be, and that the antecedent of "you" is not ambiguous, but is in fact Gentiles. And though Allen committed to the same misreading of Romans 1:13 as Breda and Lay, he also contradicted himself, showing that he knows full well that the natural reading of the phrase "the rest of" or "the other" means that the two groups on either side of the phrase are subsections of a larger group, in this case, the Gentiles. This is important because both Lay and Breda put the full weight of two-part Romans on the so-called ambiguous antecedent of 1:13. Here's Lay's commitment to his reading of this verse. The correct interpretation or application of this verse is key to understanding that Paul is writing to the Jewish believers throughout the first 8 chapters. That's page 17. Here's Breda also explaining the importance of Romans 1:13. You might be asking, why does it matter if Romans 1:13 contains an ambiguous antecedent? It makes all the difference in the world, because this will formulate how one interprets the entire book of Romans. It is analogous for a survey class, with the instructor emphasizing that if you start at a wrong point, no matter how precise the measures are, or precise the degrees of angles are performed, the survey would always be wrong, because you're starting at the wrong starting point. Both Allen and Breda clearly demonstrate that they understand what is being plainly said in Romans 1:13, that you are Gentiles. In so doing, they undercut the entire two-part Roman system. But both persist in putting forward Lay's erroneous idea. Because of the weight placed on the non-existent ambiguous antecedent, all of the work done by Lay, Breda, and Allen is for naught. Without this foundation, there is no two-part Romans. We could end our review right here. There's no need to have continued after page 17 of Lay's book. Built on a foundation of sand, Lay's book is therefore pointless, as well as the rest of the commentaries. But we can continue on, if only for mere curiosity. Another area of contradiction that Allen shows in his book is that in the boldness of Paul's preaching. Allen insists that when Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel," in Romans 1:16, it is a very bold statement. He asserts that Paul has no need to be bold to Gentiles, since he was already well known for preaching to Gentiles. Allen concludes that an audience of Jewish Christians gives more meaning to this boldness. In Romans 1:16, if Paul is speaking either exclusively to the Jews or inclusively to them along with Gentiles, it adds meaning to his bold language that "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of salvation to everyone that believes." It seems lost on Allen that Paul is also known for preaching in synagogues and getting thrown out of them and getting followed to other towns to be persecuted or even stoned. He was well known for this, as well as preaching to the Gentiles. But Allen reverses this for Romans 15, verses 15 and 16, saying that the audience is Gentiles and not Jews directly. let's see. When Paul writes, "Nevertheless, brethren, I have written more boldly unto you, in some sort, as putting you in mind, because of the grace that is given to me of God, that I should be minister of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, ministering the gospel of God, that the offering up of the Gentiles might be acceptable, being sanctified by the Holy Spirit." The "unto you" refers to Gentiles, therefore Paul is not writing to Jews directly. Well, which is it? Paul's inferred boldness of 1:16 means that the audience is Jewish, but here, when Paul says he is being bold, the audience is Gentile. This is contradictory. But even if Paul is being bold with a Jewish audience in 1:16, we see no requirement for the audience in Rome to be predominantly or exclusively Jewish Christians. Another area of contradiction in Allen's book is that of the meaning of third-person references. Allen, like Lay, makes the mistake of inferring that references to a group in third person mean that the audience can't be part of that referenced group. Thus, if Paul mentions Gentiles, he must not be speaking to Gentiles. In Romans 2:14, he says, when Paul states, "When the Gentiles which have not the law," Paul is not likely speaking to the Gentiles, but speaking to the Jews about the Gentiles. That's Thesis 21, page 64. A couple of pages later, Allen says, in Romans 3:1, when Paul questions what advantage then has the Jew, or what profit is there in circumcision, Paul is not asking Gentiles about the profit of circumcision. Thesis 26, page 66. Here, Paul is speaking of the Jews in third person, but Allen says this is Paul speaking to Jewish Christians. In another place, Allen makes this case again. In Romans 11:11, when Paul states, "Through their fall, salvation comes unto the Gentiles, to provoke them to jealousy," the "their" and the "them" represent the Israelites. Therefore, Paul is not writing to Jews in first person, but about them in third person. Thesis 54, page 104. Allen claims that Israelites are mentioned for the first time in third person in Romans 9. Paul is writing to Gentiles as he defines his brothers as Israelites and refers to them in third person for the first time in this letter, Allen's emphasis. At this point, Paul is writing about the Jews, not to the Jews, page 94. What's interesting about this is that Allen had already claimed that in Romans 1:18 through 32, that the words "they" and "them" refer to Jews. They and them, you will notice, are third-person pronouns. In Romans 1, then, Paul would be speaking about Jews in third person. And being that that would be the first chapter of Romans, and if Allen continues to hold that that passage is about the Jews, then Romans 9 would not, in fact, have to be the first mention of Jews in third person. And actually, he's completely wrong anyway. Here are explicit mentions of Jews in third person in the early chapters of Romans. There's 1:16, 2:9, 2:28 and 29, 3:1 and 2, and 3:29. Here implied mentions of Jews being described as the circumcised, 4:9 and 4:12. Yet as we saw in Thesis 54, when Paul speaks about the Jews in third person, Allen would have us agree that Paul is not speaking to Jews. This creates an obvious contradiction. Even if Allen were correct, and no Jews are referred to in third person in the first 8 chapters of Romans, it still leaves him with a problem. It does not therefore require that the audience be either predominantly or exclusively Jewish Christians. There is a fourth area of contradictions in his book, and that is the meaning of election. In speaking of Romans 9:13, Allen says, as an election of service, Paul's point is God has the prerogative to make this choice. This is the same prerogative of election that Paul has explained to Gentiles, which applies to a portion of Israel for a season, page 97. Then, speaking of Romans 11:7, Allen says, Paul is referring to 2 different groups of Israelites, the elect and the rest, and he is writing to the Gentiles. The elect are individual believing Israelites viewed as a group. That's Thesis 53, page 103. Then he says, Paul is defining the elect as that portion of Israel who believed and was not hardened. The contradiction here is that Allen recognizes that the elect are saved, and that those hardened are not saved. To whatever service he thinks that the elect are chosen, salvation seems to be an important part of it, as elect Israelites are saved, and hardened ones clearly are not. So those four areas comprise the four important contradictions in Allen's book. And this provides you with a brief overview and my experience of reading it. At no point in interacting with Allen's ideas did I find any passage that required that the audience be either predominantly or exclusively Jewish Christians, which was his whole concept behind writing the book. It never seemed to be required that the audience be predominantly or exclusively Jewish Christians. And with the failure of the misidentified ambiguous antecedent, the entire work is undermined to its own destruction. There really is no point in going into two-part Romans beyond the insistence that 113 has an ambiguous antecedent, when plainly, as seen by the speech of both Allen and Breda, that they fully understand what the phrase the rest of, or as among the other, will do to connecting one group to another in a sentence. They undermine the entire system. There's no point in continuing on with two-part Romans after that. If it interests the audience, I may go through thesis by thesis of Allen's book. There are, in fact, 95 theses across 6 chapters in his book. That would be a lot of labor, and I may consider doing that. Just for interest's sake, we have to understand that the entire system is already dead on arrival, with Romans 1:13 being clear that it's speaking about Gentiles. Now, you may be asking, so Reformed Pilgrim, what do you really think is the audience in Romans? It appears to be, by Paul's language, a majority Gentile audience, with Jews there as well. That is also, ironically, David Allen's opinion as well. He believes there's a majority Gentile congregation with some Jews there. Make of that what you will. All right, until next time, have a great day in the Lord.